Chapter 1: The Job That Shouldn't Exist. Mark Barrett woke up to the sound of jingling bells and the faint aroma of peppermint. For the 100th time since arriving at the North Pole, he stared at the ceiling and thought, "This is the day I wake up from the coma." He sat up in bed, rubbed his eyes, and squinted at the glowing candy cane clock on the wall. 6:30 a.m. The dorm heater hummed softly, and outside his frosted window, snowflakes fell like confetti at a parade. It was picturesque, magical, and absolutely impossible. Mark swung his legs over the side of the bed, muttering, "Still here. Still not Kansas." He pulled on his boots, shrugged into his parka, and stepped into the hallway, where the scent of cocoa hit him like a warm hug. The employee dorms were bustling. Humans in red and green uniforms shuffled toward the conveyor belt station, chatting about toy quotas and cookie breaks. Mark nodded politely, though inside he was screaming, "None of this is real. Can't be real. Magic isn't real. Flying reindeer aren't real." Except they were. He reached the conveyor belt entrance and paused. It was a marvel of engineering or insanity. Rows of cushioned seats lined the moving platform, separated by tables piled high with Christmas candy. Elves zipped past, their pointy shoes flashing like disco lights, carrying trays of cocoa topped with mountains of whipped cream. Mark climbed aboard and sat down, gripping the edge of the table as the belt lurched forward. Across from him, an elf with a peppermint-striped hat grinned. "Morning, Mark. Extra whipped cream today." Mark forced a smile. "I'm good, thanks." The elf shrugged and slid a mug toward him anyway. Cocoa sloshed over the rim, drowning a marshmallow snowman. Mark stared at it like it held the answers to life's greatest mysteries. How did I get here? The answer, of course, involved a series of mistakes, misunderstandings, and one very ornery reindeer. Barrett. Mark turned to see Prancer trotting alongside the conveyor belt, antlers gleaming under the twinkling lights. The reindeer's grin was pure joy with antlers. "You look like someone stole your tinsel," Prancer said, voice rich with amusement. Mark sighed. "Morning, Prancer." "Morning? It's a glorious day. Snow's perfect, cocoa's flowing, and Rudolph hasn't insulted anyone yet." "Well, not loudly." Mark shook his head. "I'm still waiting to wake up." Prancer snorted. "You humans, always questioning the magic. Just enjoy the ride." With a wink, the reindeer pranced off, leaving Mark to wonder if he'd officially lost his mind. The conveyor belt glided past another cocoa station, where elves were practically drowning mugs in whipped cream. Mark watched one elf pile so much cream onto a cup that it toppled over like a sugary avalanche. The elf cheered. The crowd applauded. Mark groaned. "This is my life now." He worked in the dorm's human employee housing, to be exact. His job was to keep everything running smoothly. Maintenance, scheduling, conflict resolution. It wasn't dangerous, but the mental gymnastics involved could traumatize anyone who wasn't flexible. Luckily, Mark was open-minded about work. About relationships, not so much. He believed in respect, mutual reflection. No games, no drama. Just two people who understood that how you treat each other says everything. Simple. Traditional. Which was ironic, considering he now lived in a world where reindeer talked, elves teleported, and Santa was a real person with a surprisingly sarcastic sense of humor. The conveyor belt slowed, and Mark hopped off, heading toward the dorm office. He passed a bulletin board plastered with holiday notices. Cookie bake-off tonight. Ugly sweater contest tomorrow. Mandatory caroling practice. Don't skip. Mark rubbed his temples. Coma. Definitely a coma. He pushed open the office door and froze. Standing by the desk was a woman he'd never seen before. She wore a crimson coat, her dark hair tumbling over her shoulders like a glossy ribbon. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, and her smile could melt the Arctic. "Hi," she said, voice warm as cocoa. "You must be Mark Barrett." Mark blinked. Words failed him. His brain, usually sharp enough to juggle elf schedules and reindeer drama, short-circuited. "I'm Holly Winters," she continued, extending a gloved hand. "Logistics. I'll be working with you on housing assignments." Mark shook her hand, trying not to notice how perfectly it fit in his. Welcome." Holly glanced around the office, then back at him with a grin. "So this is the famous dorm manager. I've heard you're the guy who thinks none of this is real." Mark stiffened. "Who told you that?" "Prancer," she said, laughing. "He said you're waiting to wake up from a coma." Mark groaned. "That reindeer has no concept of privacy." Holly leaned against the desk, eyes dancing. "Well, if this is a coma, it's the most festive one I've ever seen." Mark stared at her, heart doing an odd little flip. For the first time since arriving at the North Pole, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to wake up. Chapter 2: A Snowstorm of Mistakes. Mark Barrett had always believed life was a series of choices. Good choices led to stability. Bad choices led to chaos. And then there were the choices that weren't choices at all. The ones that happened because the universe decided to play a practical joke on you. His arrival at the North Pole? Definitely the latter. It all started 3 weeks ago, in a cramped office in Des Moines, Iowa, where Mark had been working as a consultant for a logistics firm. His job was stressful mental gymnastics on steroids, but he was good at it. He thrived on solving impossible puzzles, untangling snarled supply chains, and making sense of chaos. What he didn't thrive on was holiday parties. So when his boss cornered him at the company Christmas mixer with a mug of hot cocoa and said, "Barrett, you're perfect for this special assignment," Mark should have run. Instead, he nodded politely, because that's what polite people do when their boss is holding a beverage that could stain their shirt. Special assignment? Mark asked, already regretting the question. North Pole operations, his boss said, grinning like a man who just handed off his least favorite project. They need someone who can handle complex systems. You're the guy. Mark laughed. North Pole? Like Santa Claus? Exactly. His boss clapped him on the back. You'll love it. It's festive. Festive. That was the word that started it all. Mark assumed it was a code name for some quirky warehouse in Minnesota. He signed the paperwork without reading the fine print. Because who reads fine print when there's free cocoa and a reindeer-shaped cookie staring at you? He boarded a charter flight 2 days later, expecting snow and spreadsheets. What he got was magic. The plane landed on a runway carved into a glacier. An elf in a neon green parka greeted him with a clipboard and a candy cane. Welcome to the North Pole, the elf chirped, as if this were the most normal sentence in the world. Mark blinked. Is this a theme park? The elf laughed. Oh, you humans. Always so skeptical. Before Mark could demand clarification, a reindeer trotted up, an actual reindeer with antlers like polished mahogany and eyes that gleamed with intelligence. You're late, the reindeer said, voice dripping with sarcasm. We've been waiting for hours. Mark stared. You talk. The reindeer rolled its eyes. Brilliant observation. Next you'll tell me snow is cold. That was the moment Mark decided he was in a coma. It was the only logical explanation. He'd slipped on an icy sidewalk, cracked his head, and now his brain was staging a holiday musical. The elf ushered him into a sleigh, because of course there was a sleigh, and whisked him to the employee dorms, where humans lived in relative normalcy while elves zipped in and out of a shimmering portal to their own city. Mark spent the first night waiting for reality to snap back. Didn't. Instead, he woke up to cocoa stations, conveyor belts, and Prancer, the reindeer with a personality bigger than his antlers, giving him unsolicited life advice. You need to loosen up, Prancer said on day 2, trotting alongside Mark as he tried to make sense of the dorm schedule. You're wound tighter than a candy cane in a toddler's fist. Mark ignored him. He had work to do. Housing assignments, maintenance requests, conflict resolution between humans who couldn't agree on thermostat settings. It was like managing a college dorm, except with more glitter and fewer hangovers. The mistakes started small. Mark accidentally scheduled 2 cookie baking contests in the same kitchen. Then he approved a request for extra marshmallows without realizing it would trigger a marshmallow avalanche in the cafeteria. The elves thought it was hilarious. Mark thought it was a lawsuit waiting to happen. But the real disaster, the one that sealed his fate, was the cocoa incident. It was a Tuesday. Mark was reviewing dorm rosters when an elf burst into the office, shouting, "Emergency! Cocoa shortage!" Mark blinked. How is that an emergency? The elf gasped. It's cocoa season. We can't run operations without cocoa. Mark sighed and grabbed the nearest clipboard. Fine. I'll handle it. He marched to the supply depot, found a stack of cocoa crates, and authorized a transfer. Simple. Except he didn't notice the crates were labeled experimental cocoa blend. Do not distribute. By the time he realized his mistake, half the North Pole was on a sugar high, elves were breakdancing on conveyor belts, and Rudolph was singing karaoke in the reindeer lounge. Santa himself showed up, arms crossed, eyes twinkling with amusement. Barrett, he said, voice deep and warm like a crackling fire. You've caused quite a stir. Mark braced for termination. Instead, Santa chuckled. You've got spirit. We need that around here. And just like that, Mark was promoted to dorm manager. No interview, no training, just a pat on the back and a mug of cocoa that tasted suspiciously like regret. Now, 3 weeks later, Mark sat in his office, staring at Holly Winters, the woman who just walked in like she owned the place. She was smiling, and Mark had the distinct feeling she knew exactly how much chaos he'd caused. So, Holly said, dropping a folder on the desk, I hear you're the guy who turned the North Pole into a cocoa-fueled dance party. Mark groaned. That was an accident. Holly laughed, a sound like sleigh bells on a crisp winter night. Relax, Barrett. I'm not here to judge. I'm here to help. Mark eyed her warily. Help with what? Logistics, she said, sliding into the chair across from him. Housing assignments, supply coordination, crisis prevention. Basically, making sure you don't accidentally start another marshmallow avalanche. Mark rubbed his temples. That happened once. Once is enough, Holly said, grinning. But don't worry. I'm good at fixing mistakes. Mark studied her, trying to ignore the way her smile made his chest feel oddly warm. He didn't believe in magic, not really, but looking at Holly Winters, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was willing to make an exception. Chapter 3, Enter Holly Winters. Mark Barrett prided himself on being composed under pressure. He could juggle elf schedules, negotiate thermostat wars, and survive cocoa shortages without breaking a sweat. But Holly Winters? Holly Winters was a different kind of pressure. one that made his brain short-circuit every time she smiled. She was standing in the dorm office now, flipping through a folder like she owned the place. Her crimson coat was draped over the chair, revealing a fitted green sweater that looked festive without trying too hard. Her dark hair shimmered under the glow of twinkling lights strung across the ceiling, and Mark had the ridiculous urge to check if his shirt had any cocoa stains. "So," Holly said, glancing up with a grin that could melt glaciers, "I've reviewed the housing assignments. You've got 3 humans sharing a room meant for 2, and 1 guy who claims his roommate snores like a chainsaw." Mark groaned. "That's Jenkins. He's filed 6 complaints. I'm considering earplugs as a diplomatic solution." Holly laughed, the sound like sleigh bells on a crisp winter night. "Earplugs? Bold strategy." Mark shrugged. "It's either that or soundproofing the entire dorm, and I'm pretty sure Santa won't approve the budget." Holly leaned against the desk, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "You know, for someone who doesn't believe any of this is real, you're awfully invested in keeping the peace." Mark stiffened. "Prancer told you that, didn't he?" "Of course," Holly said, smirking. "He also said you're waiting to wake up from a coma." Mark rubbed his temples. "That reindeer needs a hobby." "Oh, he has one," Holly said. "It's called meddling." Mark groaned. "Figures." Holly slid the folder toward him. "Anyway, I've got a plan. We'll reshuffle the rooms, move Jenkins to the single, and bribe the others with extra cocoa rations." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Bribery? That's your solution?" "Bribery works wonders around here," Holly said, grinning. "Especially when whipped cream is involved." Mark chuckled despite himself. "You sound like you've done this before." "Logistics is my specialty," Holly said, tapping the folder. "I've handled everything from elf transport schedules to reindeer spa appointments." Mark blinked. "Reindeer? Spa appointments?" Holly nodded solemnly. "They're very particular about their antlers." Mark shook his head. "I'm definitely in a coma." Holly laughed again, and Mark felt something shift, something warm and unsettling, like the first sip of cocoa on a freezing day. He wasn't sure if it was attraction or insanity, but either way he was in trouble. Before he could dwell on it, the office door burst open and Prancer trotted in, antlers gleaming like polished mahogany. "Barrett," the reindeer announced, voice rich with amusement. "You've got a situation." Mark sighed. "What now?" Prancer grinned. "Elf conveyor belt jam. Candy cane overload. It's a sticky mess." Mark groaned. "Of course it is." Holly grabbed her coat. "Come on, Barrett. Let's go save Christmas." Mark stared at her. "You're enjoying this way too much." Holly winked. "Maybe I just like watching you panic." Mark opened his mouth to retort, but Prancer cut in. "Tick-tock, humans. The cocoa stations are under siege." Mark muttered something about comas and followed Holly out the door. As they hurried down the hallway, Mark couldn't help noticing the way her hair bounced when she walked, or how her laughter lingered like music in the air. He told himself it was nothing. Just holiday cheer. Just festive insanity. But deep down, he knew the truth. Holly Winters was trouble, the kind of trouble that made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to wake up. Chapter 4: Cocoa Diplomacy. The North Pole cafeteria was a riot of color and chaos. Garland draped from the rafters. Twinkling lights blinked like mischievous eyes, and the scent of sugar hung thick in the air. At the center of it all stood the cocoa station. A gleaming counter piled high with mugs, marshmallows, and enough whipped cream to sculpt a snowman army. Mark Barrett approached cautiously, like a man entering enemy territory. Holly Winters was already there, chatting with an elf who was wielding a whipped cream dispenser like a weapon. She turned as Mark arrived, her smile bright enough to rival the fairy lights overhead. "Barrett," she said, sliding a steaming mug toward him. "You look like you need this." Mark eyed the cocoa suspiciously. "Is it safe?" Holly laughed. "Relax. It's the regular blend. No experimental additives." Mark picked up the mug, inhaling the rich chocolate aroma. "Good. I'm still recovering from the last sugar apocalypse." Holly grinned. "You mean the one you caused?" Mark groaned. "Are you ever going to let that go?" "Not a chance," Holly said, stirring her own cocoa with a candy cane. "It's legendary now. Elves are calling it the Great Cocoa Uprising." Mark muttered something about comas and took a sip. The cocoa was perfect, warm, sweet, and just enough to make him forget, for a moment, that he was living in a snow globe of insanity. "So," Holly said, leaning against the counter, "tell me something, Barrett. Why do you look like a man who's allergic to fun?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "Allergic to fun?" "Yeah," Holly said, eyes dancing. "Everyone else here is embracing the magic. You act like you're waiting for someone to pinch you." Mark hesitated, then shrugged. "Because none of this is real." Holly tilted her head. "You really believe that?" "I know it," Mark said. "Magic doesn't exist. Talking reindeer don't exist. Elves don't exist. This is a very elaborate hallucination." Holly laughed softly. "You're serious." "Dead serious," Mark said, taking another sip of cocoa. "And because it's not real, normal rules don't apply." Holly frowned. "Normal rules?" Mark nodded. Relationships, respect, the stuff that matters. People treat this place like a holiday free-for-all. But that's not how life works. Holly studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. You're traditional. Mark bristled. Not in the barefoot in the kitchen sense. I didn't say that, Holly said, smiling. So what does traditional mean to you? Mark hesitated, then spoke slowly. It means respect, mutual reflection. How you treat each other says everything. It's not about image. It's about knowing you're a team. Holly's smile softened. That's actually kind of nice. Mark blinked. You sound surprised. I am, Holly admitted. Most guys I meet think respect means letting them win at board games. Mark chuckled. I'm not most guys. I can tell, Holly said, her eyes locking on his. For a moment, the cafeteria noise faded. The laughter, the clinking mugs, even the elf who was now spraying whipped cream into their own mouth like a fire hose. It was just Mark and Holly, standing in a bubble of cocoa-scented quiet. Then Prancer trotted in, shattering the moment like a dropped ornament. Barrett! The reindeer bellowed, antlers gleaming. You're needed in the lounge. Rudolph's staging a protest. Mark groaned. What now? Something about antler polish, Prancer said. It's a whole thing. Holly laughed, grabbing her coat. Come on, Barrett. Let's go negotiate peace. Mark followed her, muttering under his breath. Cocoa diplomacy. That's my life now. Holly glanced back, her smile teasing. Could be worse. Mark raised an eyebrow. How? You could be stuck in a coma, Holly said, winking. Mark opened his mouth to reply, but the words got lost somewhere between his brain and his heart. Because for the first time since arriving at the North Pole, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to wake up. Chapter 5, The Reindeer Intervention. Mark Barrett had learned two things since arriving at the North Pole. 1. Never underestimate the chaos potential of elves armed with candy canes. 2. Never, under any circumstances, trust a reindeer with an agenda. Unfortunately, he was about to break rule number 2. It started innocently enough. Mark was reviewing dorm maintenance requests. Someone wanted heated towel racks. Someone else demanded a cookie-only vending machine. When Prancer trotted into the office like a four-legged diplomat. Barrett? Prancer said, antlers gleaming under the twinkling lights. We need to talk. Mark didn't look up. If this is about Rudolph's antler polish protest, I already sent Holly to handle it. Prancer snorted. Forget Rudolph. This is bigger. Mark sighed. Define bigger. Prancer leaned in, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Your love life. Mark froze, pen hovering over the page. My what? Don't play coy, Prancer said, grinning. You've got that look. What look? The look of a man who's been hit by Cupid's candy cane, Prancer said, eyes twinkling. And her name is Holly Winters. Mark groaned. Prancer? Don't deny it, Prancer said, prancing in place. You two have chemistry. I can smell it. Mark rubbed his temples. You're a reindeer. You can't smell chemistry. Please, Prancer said, tossing his antlers. I can smell mistletoe from a mile away. And you, my friend, are practically marinating in romantic tension. Mark opened his mouth to argue, but the door burst open and Rudolph strutted in, nose glowing like a neon sign. Prancer, are you meddling again? Not meddling, Prancer said innocently. Facilitating destiny. Rudolph rolled his eyes. You're ridiculous. Ridiculously helpful, Prancer said. Listen, Barrett needs a push. Mark stood, exasperated. I don't need a push. I need peace and quiet. Too late, Prancer said, grinning. We've arranged something. Mark narrowed his eyes. Arranged what? Before Prancer could answer, Holly appeared in the doorway, cheeks flushed from the cold, hair dusted with snowflakes. Barrett, she said, smiling. You ready? Mark blinked. Ready for what? The conveyor belt, Holly said, holding up a clipboard. Elf transport jam. We need to ride it to the main portal and sort things out. Mark groaned. Of course we do. Prancer winked. Enjoy the ride. The conveyor belt was pure chaos. Elves zipped past in a blur of green and red. Candy canes clattered on tables, and cocoa mugs sloshed dangerously close to disaster. Mark and Holly squeezed into a seat, shoulder to shoulder, while Prancer and Rudolph trotted alongside like smug chaperones. This is insane, Mark muttered, gripping the edge of the table as the belt lurched forward. Holly laughed, her eyes sparkling. You say that like it's a bad thing. Mark glanced at her, trying not to notice how close she was, or how good she smelled, like cinnamon and snow. I'm just saying, normal workplaces don't involve conveyor belts and cocoa stations. Normal workplaces are boring, Holly said, grinning. This place? It's magic. Mark shook his head. Magic isn't real. Holly tilted her head. Then how do you explain talking reindeer? Mark shot a glare at Prancer, who was trotting alongside with a smug grin. Hallucination. Prancer snorted. Keep telling yourself that, Barrett. Holly laughed, and Mark felt that now familiar warmth in his chest, the one that made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to wake up. The belt jolted, sending Holly tumbling against him. Mark caught her instinctively, his hands gripping her arms. For a moment, time froze. Her eyes met his, wide and bright, and Mark forgot how to breathe. "Sorry," Holly murmured, her voice soft. "No problem," Mark said, his own voice sounding strange, rough, like he'd swallowed a snowflake sideways. Prancer cleared his throat loudly. "Well, well, well, look at that. Fate in action." Rudolph smirked. "You're shameless." "Efficient," Prancer corrected. "Shamelessly efficient." Mark groaned, releasing Holly and muttering something about reindeer conspiracies. But as the conveyor belt carried them forward, shoulder to shoulder, cocoa-scented air swirling around them, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe Prancer was right. Maybe fate was meddling. And maybe he didn't mind. Chapter 6, The Great Ornament Disaster. Mark Barrett had survived cocoa uprisings, conveyor belt chaos, and reindeer matchmaking schemes. He thought he'd seen it all. Then came the ornaments. It started as a simple task: decorate the dorm lounge for the annual Christmas Eve mixer. Holly Winters was in charge, because of course she was, and Mark had been drafted as her reluctant assistant. He told himself it was just logistics: hanging garland, stringing lights, placing ornaments. Easy, safe, non-chaotic. He was wrong. The lounge looked like a holiday magazine exploded. Boxes of ornaments lined the walls, glittering in every shade of red, gold, and silver. Holly stood in the center, clipboard in hand, looking like the CEO of Christmas. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her green sweater matched the garland draped across the fireplace. Mark tried not to notice how effortlessly festive she looked. "Okay," Holly said, scanning her list. "We'll start with the tree. Ornaments first, then lights." Mark eyed the towering evergreen in the corner. "That thing is huge. Go big or go home," Holly said, grinning. "Besides, it's tradition." Mark muttered something about traditions and grabbed a box of ornaments. They were delicate, shimmering spheres that looked like they belonged in a museum, not in the hands of a man who still wasn't convinced he wasn't hallucinating. "Careful," Holly warned, as Mark lifted the box. "Those are hand-blown crystal." Mark froze. "Hand-blown? By elves," Holly said, smiling. "They take pride in their work." Mark swallowed hard. No pressure. He climbed the step stool and reached for a branch, balancing the ornament like it was a live grenade. Holly watched, amusement dancing in her eyes. "You're very tense," she said. "I'm holding a glass ball worth more than my car," Mark muttered. "Relax," Holly said, laughing. "It's just an ornament." "Just an ornament?" Mark shot her a look. "Last time someone said just, I ended up causing a cocoa riot." Holly grinned. "Fair point." Mark hooked the ornament onto the branch and exhaled in relief. One down, 99 to go. He reached for the next ornament, and that's when disaster struck. The step stool wobbled. Mark flailed. The box tipped. Ornaments tumbled like glittering meteors, shattering against the hardwood floor in a symphony of chaos. "Barrett!" Holly gasped, diving to save the last two ornaments before they met their doom. She cradled them like fragile kittens, while Mark stood frozen, surrounded by shards of holiday catastrophe. "Oh no!" Mark whispered. "Oh no, no, no!" Holly looked up, her expression torn between horror and laughter. "Well, that's one way to make a statement." Mark groaned. "I'm dead. Santa's going to put me on the naughty list forever." Holly set the surviving ornaments on the table and knelt to inspect the damage. "Okay, it's bad, but not fatal." "Not fatal." Mark stared at the glittering wreckage. "This looks like a crime scene." Holly laughed, the sound bright and warm. "Relax, Barrett. We'll fix it." Mark blinked. "How?" "Glue, glitter, and a little Christmas magic," Holly said, winking. "Come on, help me sweep." Mark grabbed a broom, still muttering under his breath. "Coma. Definitely a coma." As they worked side by side, sweeping shards into a dustpan, Holly glanced at him. "You know, for a guy who doesn't believe in magic, you're awfully good at creating chaos." Mark smirked. "It's a gift." Holly grinned. "Maybe that's your magic." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "If breaking things counts as magic, I'm a wizard." Holly laughed again, and Mark felt that now familiar warmth in his chest, the one that made him forget the mess, the stress, and the fact that he was living in a snow globe of insanity. For a moment, it was just the two of them, kneeling on the floor, surrounded by shards of crystal and twinkling lights. And Mark realized something. He didn't mind the chaos. Not if Holly was in it with him. Chapter 7, Midnight Sleigh Ride. Mark Barrett had a list of things he never expected to do in life. Ride a magical sleigh under the northern lights was somewhere near the top, right between argue with a talking reindeer and manage elf housing assignments. Yet here he was, standing in the reindeer stables at midnight, staring at a sleigh that looked like it had been designed by a team of overcaffeinated elves with a glitter obsession. Holly Winters was adjusting the harness on Prancer, her breath puffing in the icy air. She wore a white knit hat that framed her face like a snowflake crown, and Mark had the ridiculous urge to check if his hair looked halfway decent under his hood. Spoiler, it didn't. "Are you sure this is safe?" Mark asked, eyeing the sleigh like it might spontaneously combust. Holly grinned. Safe-ish. Mark groaned. That's not comforting. Relax, Holly said, patting Prancer's neck. He's a professional. Prancer tossed his antlers and winked. Best in the business. Mark muttered. I'm definitely in a coma. Holly laughed, climbing into the sleigh with the grace of someone who'd done this 100 times. Come on, Barrett. Live a little. Mark hesitated, then climbed in, settling beside her on the plush red seat. The sleigh smelled faintly of pine and peppermint, and the cushions were so soft he wondered if they were stuffed with clouds. Holly handed him a blanket, green with gold trim, and Mark draped it over his lap, trying not to notice how close her shoulder was to his. Ready? Holly asked, eyes sparkling. No, Mark said honestly. Too bad, Holly said and snapped the reins. The sleigh lurched forward, and Mark's stomach dropped as they soared into the night sky. Wind whipped through his hair, snowflakes stung his cheeks, and the world below blurred into a glittering patchwork of lights. He gripped the edge of the seat like a man clinging to sanity. This is insane, he shouted over the wind. This is magic, Holly shouted back, laughing. Her laughter rang out like sleigh bells, bright and fearless, and Mark felt something shift inside him, something warm and wild, like cocoa spiked with adrenaline. They climbed higher, the stars stretching like diamonds across a velvet sky. Then the northern lights appeared, ribbons of green and purple swirling like a celestial dance. Mark stared, breathless. Wow, he whispered. Holly glanced at him, her smile softening. Beautiful, isn't it? Mark nodded, unable to tear his eyes away. Yeah. For a moment, the chaos of the North Pole faded. The conveyor belts, the cocoa stations, the ornament disaster. It was just the two of them, wrapped in a blanket, soaring through a sky painted with light. Holly shifted slightly, her shoulder brushing his. Still think magic isn't real? Mark swallowed hard. I don't know anymore. Holly smiled, her eyes shimmering like the lights above. Maybe you don't have to know. Maybe you just have to believe. Mark looked at her then, really looked, and felt his heart stumble like a rookie reindeer on an icy runway. He wanted to say something clever or profound, but the words tangled in his throat. Before he could untangle them, Prancer called back, voice dripping with amusement. If you two start kissing, warn me. I don't need that kind of distraction mid-flight. Holly laughed, cheeks flushing pink. Mark groaned. Prancer. Just saying, Prancer said, grinning. Safety first. Mark muttered something about reindeer conspiracies, but as the sleigh glided through the shimmering lights, Holly's laughter lingering in the air, he realized something. He didn't care if this was magic or madness, because for the first time in a long time, Mark Barrett felt alive. Chapter 8, The Clause in the Contract. Mark Barrett had never been a fine print guy. Contracts were boring, predictable, until they weren't. Case in point, the one currently spread across his desk, glowing faintly like it had been sprinkled with pixie dust. He stared at the page, blinking at the words that seemed to shimmer under the twinkling lights of the dorm office. Clause 12. Continuity of employment. Employee may remain at the North Pole only if they demonstrate belief in the operational magic sustaining Christmas. Failure to comply will result in immediate reassignment to the human world. Mark rubbed his temples. This has to be a joke. Not a joke, said a voice behind him. He turned to see Holly Winters leaning against the doorframe, her crimson coat draped over one arm, her smile equal parts amused and sympathetic. You found the clause. Mark held up the contract like it was Exhibit A in a trial. This is insane. Insane or festive? Holly teased, stepping closer. Depends on your perspective. Mark groaned. Perspective? Holly, this says I have to believe in magic or I get shipped back to Iowa. Holly shrugged. That's the deal. Mark dropped into his chair, staring at the glowing words. I can't believe this. Exactly, Holly said, grinning. That's the problem. Mark shot her a look. You think this is funny? A little, Holly admitted, her eyes dancing. You've spent weeks insisting this is a coma, and now the universe is calling your bluff. Mark leaned back, exasperated. I'm a logistics guy. I deal in facts, numbers, reality. Belief isn't practical. Holly crossed the room and perched on the edge of his desk, her presence warm and distracting. Maybe practicality isn't everything. Mark frowned. Easy for you to say. You believe in all this. Holly tilted her head. You think I just woke up one day and decided magic was real? Mark hesitated. Didn't you? No, Holly said softly. I had doubts. Big ones. But then I saw what happens when people stop believing. Things fall apart. Not just here. Everywhere. Mark stared at her, the weight of her words settling like snow. You really think belief matters that much? Holly nodded. Belief is what keeps the lights on. Literally. Mark glanced at the contract again, frustration gnawing at him. So what? I fake it? Pretend I believe. Holly's gaze sharpened. That's not how it works. You can't fake magic. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know if I can do this. Holly leaned closer, her voice gentle. Maybe stop thinking so hard. Stop trying to control everything. Just let yourself feel it. Mark looked at her then, really looked, and felt something shift inside him. Maybe it wasn't magic in the traditional sense. Maybe it was the way her eyes shimmered like Christmas lights, or how her smile made the chaos feel less overwhelming. Maybe belief wasn't about logic at all. Before he could say anything, Prancer's head popped through the doorway, antlers gleaming. Barrett, you're not quitting, are you? Mark groaned. Prancer, because if you leave, who's going to keep Rudolph from starting another antler polish protest? Prancer grinned. Think of the greater good. Holly laughed, and Mark couldn't help smiling too, despite the absurdity, despite the pressure, despite everything. Because maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe. Not in magic. Not yet. But in something else entirely. Chapter 9, Cocoa Confessions. The Cocoa Station had become Mark Barrett's unofficial therapy office. Something about the warm chocolate aroma and the endless supply of whipped cream made people spill secrets like marshmallows into a mug. Tonight, it was his turn. The lounge was quiet, the chaos of the day finally settling into a soft hum of carols and twinkling lights. Mark sat at the counter, nursing a mug of cocoa topped with a modest swirl of cream. He'd learned moderation after the Great Cocoa Uprising. Holly Winters slid onto the stool beside him, her cheeks pink from the cold, her smile easy and warm. Long day? She asked, stirring her cocoa with a candy cane. Mark chuckled. Define long. Ornament disaster, antler polish protest, and a midnight sleigh ride, Holly said, ticking off the events on her fingers. That's a full calendar. Mark groaned. Don't remind me. Holly grinned. You survived. Barely? Mark muttered, then fell silent, staring into his mug like it held answers. Holly noticed, of course she did. She had a way of noticing things he wished she wouldn't. What's on your mind? She asked gently. Mark hesitated, then sighed. That clause. Holly tilted her head. The belief clause? Mark nodded. I can't stop thinking about it. About what it means. Holly waited, patient as snowfall. Mark took a breath, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I've spent my whole life trying to control things, he said quietly. Work, plans, relationships. I thought if I kept everything neat and logical, nothing could hurt me. But then I ended up here, where nothing makes sense, and everything's chaos. Holly's expression softened. Chaos isn't always bad. Mark laughed bitterly. Tell that to the shattered ornaments. Holly smiled. Even broken things can be beautiful. Mark looked at her then, his chest tightening. I'm scared, Holly. Not of magic. Not really. I'm scared of letting go. Of trusting something I can't explain. Holly's eyes shimmered like Christmas lights. You think belief is about explanations? Mark frowned. Isn't it? No, Holly said softly. Belief is about hope. About choosing to see the good, even when it's messy. Mark swallowed hard. I don't know if I can do that. Holly reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. A light touch, warm and steady. You already are. Mark stared at their hands, his heart stumbling like a rookie reindeer on ice. How do you know? Because you're here, Holly said, smiling. You could have left. You didn't. Mark laughed softly, shaking his head. Maybe I'm just stubborn. Maybe, Holly said, her voice teasing. Or maybe you're starting to believe. Mark met her gaze, and for a moment, the world narrowed to cocoa steam and twinkling lights and the quiet certainty in her eyes. He wanted to say something. Something real. Something that mattered. But before he could, Prancer's voice rang out from the doorway. Barrett. Holly. Emergency. Mark groaned. What now? Elf karaoke night, Prancer said, antlers gleaming. They're butchering jingle bells. We need backup. Holly laughed, squeezing Mark's hand before standing. Come on, Barrett. Duty calls. Mark followed her, muttering about reindeer conspiracies. But inside, something had shifted. Maybe it wasn't magic. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was Holly. And maybe that was enough. Chapter 10, Christmas Eve Chaos. Mark Barrett had seen chaos before. Corporate meltdowns, supply chain disasters, even the Great Cocoa Uprising. But nothing compared to Christmas Eve at the North Pole. It was like watching a snow globe explode in slow motion. The dorm lounge buzzed like a beehive on a sugar high. Elves zipped past with clipboards and candy canes. Reindeer pranced in the hallway, and somewhere in the distance, someone was singing Jingle Bells off-key at elf karaoke. Holly Winters stood in the center of it all, calm as a snowflake, issuing orders like a general in a glitter war. Mark, she called, waving him over. We've got a problem. Mark groaned. Of course we do. Santa's sleigh is stuck in the loading bay, Holly said, thrusting a clipboard into his hands. The conveyor belt jammed again, and half the presents are still in the sorting room. Mark stared at the clipboard like it was a death sentence. How bad is it? Bad, Holly said. If we don't fix this in the next hour, Christmas is toast. Mark muttered something about comas and followed Holly to the loading bay. It was pandemonium. Elves were shouting, presents were piled like a glittering mountain, and Prancer was pacing like a reindeer on a caffeine binge. Barrett, Prancer bellowed. Where have you been? We're on DEF CON tinsel. Mark blinked. That's not a real thing. It is now, Prancer said, tossing his antlers. Fix the belt. Mark scanned the machinery, his logistics brain kicking into overdrive. Okay, the jam's at the intake chute. We need to clear the candy overflow and reset the rollers. Holly grinned. Look at you, Mr. Crisis Management. Mark shot her a look. Don't sound so surprised. I'm impressed, Holly said, her eyes sparkling. You're like the elf whisperer. Mark chuckled despite himself. Don't tell Prancer. He'll put it on a plaque. They worked side by side, elbows bumping as they cleared candy canes and untangled ribbons. Holly's laughter rang out every time an elf tried to help by tossing glitter into the air like confetti. Mark found himself laughing too, because somehow in the middle of the madness it felt good, right? Like he belonged. Finally, the belt whirred back to life, presents gliding toward the sleigh in a glittering parade. The elves cheered. Prancer pranced. Rudolph sang a victory chorus that sounded suspiciously like a boy band ballad. Holly turned to Mark, her cheeks flushed, her smile bright. You did it. Mark shook his head. We did it. For a moment, they just stood there, the chaos swirling around them, the sleigh gleaming under the twinkling lights. Holly's eyes met his, and something in his chest shifted, something warm and certain. You know, Holly said softly, if this is a coma, it's a pretty great one. Mark laughed, his heart stumbling like a rookie reindeer on ice. Maybe I don't want to wake up. Holly's smile deepened, and before Mark could second-guess himself, he leaned in, slowly, carefully, and kissed her. It wasn't dramatic. No fireworks, no choir of elves. Just a quiet, perfect kiss in the middle of Christmas chaos, with cocoa steam curling in the air and Prancer muttering something about, finally, in the background. When they pulled apart, Holly's eyes were shining. So, does this mean you believe? Mark grinned. In magic? Not sure. In you? Absolutely. Holly laughed and Mark knew, really knew, that he wasn't going anywhere. Not tonight. Not ever. Chapter 11 The Kiss Under the Mistletoe. The North Pole had a way of turning chaos into charm. By the time the last present was loaded onto Santa's sleigh and the elves had dispersed to their cocoa-fueled after-party, the dorm lounge was quiet, almost serene. Twinkling lights cast a soft glow over garland-draped walls, and the scent of cinnamon lingered like a secret. Mark Barrett stood near the fireplace, nursing a mug of cocoa he didn't really need. His heart was still racing from the whirlwind of the last hour, the conveyor belt jam, the glitter avalanche, the sleigh rescue. But mostly it was racing because of Holly Winters. She was across the room now, hanging up her crimson coat, her dark hair tumbling over her shoulders like a ribbon unspooling. When she turned and smiled at him, Mark felt something in his chest shift, something warm and certain, like the click of a puzzle piece falling into place. Quiet at last, Holly said, crossing the room to join him. Her voice was soft, threaded with exhaustion and something else, something tender. Mark chuckled. I didn't think quiet existed here. Miracles happen, Holly teased, her eyes sparkling. Even at the North Pole. Mark smiled, his fingers tightening around the mug. You were amazing tonight. Holly tilted her head. We were amazing. Mark shook his head. No, you kept everything from falling apart. Holly laughed softly. You helped. Mark hesitated, then set his mug down, his pulse thudding like sleigh bells in his ears. Holly. She looked at him, her expression open and curious. Mark. He took a breath, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I don't know if I believe in magic. I don't know if I ever will. But I believe in you. Holly's eyes shimmered like the lights overhead. That's enough. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. The soft glow of the fireplace, the faint hum of carols drifting from somewhere down the hall. And then Mark saw it. A sprig of mistletoe dangling above them, tied with a ribbon that sparkled like starlight. Prancer's voice floated from the doorway, smug and satisfied. You're welcome. Mark groaned. Prancer. Don't waste it, the reindeer said, trotting off with a wink. Holly laughed, her cheeks flushing pink. Looks like fate's on your side. Mark smiled, stepping closer. Or a very meddlesome reindeer. Either way, Holly murmured, her voice soft as snowfall. Don't waste it. Mark didn't. He leaned in, slowly, carefully, and kissed her. It was everything he hadn't expected. Gentle and warm, sweet as cocoa and bright as Christmas lights. No chaos, no noise. Just a quiet, perfect moment under the mistletoe. With Holly's hands curling into his coat, and his heart finally letting go. When they pulled apart, Holly's smile was radiant. So, still think this is a coma? Mark grinned, his voice rough with laughter. If it is, I'm never waking up. Holly laughed, and Mark really knew, that he'd found something worth believing in. Chapter 12 A New Tradition. Christmas morning at the North Pole was a sensory overload. Bells jingling, elves singing carols in six-part harmony, and the scent of cinnamon rolls wafting through the dorm halls like a festive siren call. Mark Barrett stood by the window, watching snowflakes drift lazily across a sky painted in pink and gold. For the first time since arriving, he wasn't waiting to wake up. He was exactly where he wanted to be. Behind him, Holly Winters was perched on the arm of the couch, sipping cocoa from a mug that read Santa's favorite. Her hair was tucked under a knit hat, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold. She looked like Christmas personified, and Mark had the ridiculous urge to frame the moment and hang it on the wall. "Penny for your thoughts," Holly said, her voice warm as the cocoa in her hands. Mark turned, smiling. "You'd need a lot of pennies." Holly grinned. "Try me." Mark crossed the room and sat beside her, their shoulders brushing. "I was thinking about traditions." Holly tilted her head. "Traditions?" Mark nodded. "You said once that chaos isn't always bad, that even broken things can be beautiful. I've been wondering if maybe traditions don't have to be perfect either." Holly's smile softened. "Go on." Mark took a breath, his heart thudding like sleigh bells. "I want to start one. With you." Holly blinked, her eyes shimmering like the lights on the tree. "What kind of tradition?" Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ornament, a crystal sphere, glued back together with glitter seams. One of the casualties from the great ornament disaster, now reborn as something imperfect and beautiful. "This," Mark said, holding it out. "Every year we hang this first. A reminder that even when things break, they can still be magic." Holly stared at the ornament, then at him, her smile blooming like a poinsettia. "Mark, that's perfect." Mark chuckled. "It's lopsided." "Perfectly lopsided," Holly said, taking it from his hand. Her fingers brushed his, warm and steady. "I love it." Mark swallowed hard, his chest tightening in the best possible way. "So, what do you say? A new tradition?" Holly's eyes sparkled. "Only if we add cocoa." Mark laughed. "Deal." They stood together, walking to the tree in the corner of the lounge. Holly hooked the ornament onto the highest branch, her fingers lingering as Mark slid an arm around her waist. For a moment, the world felt still, just twinkling lights, cocoa steam, and the quiet certainty that this was where he belonged. Holly turned, her smile radiant. "Merry Christmas, Mark." Mark kissed her softly, his voice rough with laughter when they pulled apart. "Merry Christmas, Holly." And just like that, a new tradition was born. One that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with love, laughter, and a little bit of glitter. Chapter 13 Epilogue. Joy with antlers. The North Pole was quiet now. Well, as quiet as a place run by elves and reindeer could ever be. Christmas had come and gone in a blur of sleigh bells and cocoa steam, and Mark Barrett found himself standing by the dorm window, watching snowflakes drift lazily across a sky streaked with pink dawn. For the first time in weeks, there was no chaos, no conveyor belt jams, no ornament disasters. Just peace. And Holly. She was curled up on the couch behind him, wrapped in a blanket, sipping cocoa from a mug that read Elf Whisperer, a gift from Prancer, who had apparently decided Mark needed a title. Her laughter floated through the room as she scrolled through photos of the Christmas Eve madness. Elves breakdancing, Rudolph posing like a pop star, and Mark himself looking like a man who just discovered gravity was optional. Mark turned, smiling. "You're enjoying this way too much." Holly grinned. "You're photogenic in panic mode." Mark groaned. "Great, that's my legacy." Before Holly could reply, the door burst open and Prancer trotted in, antlers gleaming like polished mahogany. "Barrett," he announced, voice rich with smug satisfaction. "Time for your performance review." Mark blinked. "Performance review?" "Absolutely," Prancer said, pacing like a four-legged CEO. "Let's see. Cocoa crisis? Handled. Ornament disaster? Mostly handled. Sleigh rescue? Heroic. Kiss under the mistletoe? About time." Mark felt his ears burn. "Prancer, final score, 10 out of 10, Prancer declared. "Would recommend for future chaos." Holly laughed so hard she nearly spilled her cocoa. "You're ridiculous." "Ridiculously accurate," Prancer said, tossing his antlers. "Face it, Barrett. You belong here." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "Still not sure if this is real." Prancer winked. "Does it matter?" Mark glanced at Holly, at her smile, her warmth, the way she made the madness feel like home, and felt something settle inside him. "No," he said softly. "Not anymore." Prancer pranced toward the door, humming what sounded suspiciously like a victory tune. "Good answer. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have antler polish to supervise." When the door closed, Holly set her mug down and crossed the room, her eyes shimmering like the lights on the tree. "So, ready for our new tradition?" Mark smiled, pulling the glitter-seamed ornament from the shelf. "Always." They hung it together, fingers brushing, laughter mingling with the soft hum of carols drifting through the hall. And as Mark stood there, Holly's hand warm in his, he realized something. Life hadn't just turned upside down. It had turned magical. Not because of elves or reindeer or cocoa stations, but because of her. And for the first time in his life, Mark Barrett believed. In love. In hope. In the beautiful chaos of Christmas. Prancer's voice floated from the hallway, smug and satisfied. "Joy with antlers, baby." Mark laughed, Holly laughed, and the North Pole sparkled like never before.